So it's quite a complex business to be marketing for.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
So we're going to talk a bit about kind of how you market creatively and how you push what you're doing in the marketing realm and keep moving forwards in a world where there's restrictions, obviously big brand considerations and everything like that. But you know, how did you find like the transition from, I guess, a more B2C, slightly less restrictive world into the world of finance? Like, how did you find that?
Yeah, my journey was quite interesting because I started in retail, which obviously isn't regulated, apart from privacy regulation for
Yeah,
customers. Then I went to telco, which does have some regulations in what you can and can't do, and then into financial services. And I think what's really interesting about financial services is it's not just one regulation that covers what you can do as a marketer for that business. It's often very nuanced between businesses within the business,
yep,
which makes it even more complex. In terms of that transition, I think it's just around you get used to it. You understand what you can and can't do. You're obviously learning from people who've been in the business for many years, and it just becomes sort of part of the day-to-day process.
yeah. I can imagine it's for some people that adjustment's hard, and for others it's a bit kind of smoother and easier.
Yeah.
Um, Going on to that B2B point and like your background in retail, I think there's humongous differences in approach from B2C to B2B.
Yeah.
Like, what do you think those biggest differences are?
So I think we could call out three. I think the first one is around the ability to drive direct revenue or contribution, especially when you've got channels like e-commerce now, which are often a big proportion, if not the biggest channel within an organization. The second piece is around the budgets that you're dealing with. Because of that direct contribution, you're often dealing with direct marketing budgets that are larger. And then the final piece is around the competition. Like B2C tends to be very, very competitive
Yeah, yeah,
as a marketer, in terms of what you're trying to do and the impact you're trying to have in the market. B2B businesses are more conservative in their approach, which means that it's a little less competitive as
yeah,
a marketer, but the businesses are obviously incredibly competitive, as they're competing against each other.
yeah. Definitely. I think one of the biggest differences is that it's the direct feedback. So with ecom, you run, I don't know, so you're running Google ads or Facebook ads or whatever your channel is, you know pretty quickly if it's going well or not.
Yeah.
And you've got instant data coming back and you can adjust. With B2B, particularly a large enterprise where you're going after larger contracts with a longer sales cycle and everything else, you might have to wait 18 months to really understand if what you're doing is working.
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
So I think you're right in terms of that. I'd sum it all up in the word complexity.
Okay.
So when you think about what we have to do as B2B marketers, we're dealing with product complexity, trying to make very uh, uh, expansive financial products, the story simple when they can be applied in a lot of ways. Think about geographical complexity, think about account complexity. And in terms of pulling that together into a narrative and a story that makes sense, you have to understand the customer and how they want to receive that message, and you also have to understand how the business goes to market and make sure you align to those, because you could be telling the product story, you could be telling the account story, you could be telling the story for the geography, and those stories need to come together in a coherent way, but you also need to be able to tell them with those particular lenses.
Have you got any advice on like actually how you go about that process? So obviously you identify and understand who your customer is, but really trying to understand how to simplify your message to a point where they understand exactly what it is you do in a very succinct way is often a lot harder like than it sounds. How do you go about doing that, particularly in a very complex business with lots of different products and services? Um, I imagine it's a challenge.
So the first bit of advice is don't get lost in that complexity. So don't try and solve everything all at the beginning. I think you need to understand how the business goes to market, because that should be reflective of how the customer wants to buy buy from the business,
Hmm.
especially with how your sales team engages with them, and start with that story. So it might be a product-led story, or it might be an industry-led story, i.e., the difference between the story for a hedge fund versus a corporate. And then once you build out that overall top narrative, value proposition, reasons to believe, the key messages that flow from that, you can then start to tweak that and adapt that to other parts. If the other point I'd make is, if you've got a complex business, those bits have to come together in some way,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's normally your brand that does that in terms of creating that glue between them.
yeah. It's quite. I think it's very difficult to actually do that well.
Yeah,
Really, really difficult. Particularly, yeah, in a big company as well, where you've got lots of different teams, lots of different markets. To have that coherent
yeah,
message is really, really tough. Um, so I guess on to like marketing and pushing what you're doing forwards, because the world moves quite quickly, and particularly digital, like the platform's changing all the time. What works now is not what worked 12 months ago, etc., etc. When you're in a larger organization that has restrictions around it, how do you make sure that you're not stuck kind of standing still and getting left behind, but also balancing that with the requirements that you have?
yeah. It's You need to be very mindful about how you innovate in a safe way. And I think that you sort of do innovation at two levels. You do big innovation, big customer experience transformation programs, multi-year, and then you do small innovation, which is more around innovation in your tactics that make your marketing campaigns more effective. If I think about the small innovation, and just give you an example of something we did recently. So there's a conference called WIFIC, and that was this week in Austin, which is a big data conference. We have a booth there, we're a sponsor, and as part of that conference, we put in place a VR experience on our booth using
Cool.
the Apple Vision Pro. And it was a game where you caught the data from our data universe. And the idea being, our unique selling point is that we sell data across the latency spectrum at different speeds. So you went into this game and you caught data at different speeds. You got a score and you got a prize if you were successful. That's a great way of really reinforcing our core narrative, but through an innovative new tactic that
That's really
actually
cool.
it elevates our brand a little by having it as part of our stand.
That's really, really cool. Because I think a lot of times it's very easy to forget that you have to not necessarily entertain people, but what you're doing does have to be interesting. That's a great example of making it like that's fun.
Yeah,
It's
and
really fun.
it's within the regulation. It's within the red lines that we operate in, and it goes through various checks. And we've got a workflow. And as long as you've got that workflow, those checks, that relationship with legal compliance in place, you'll be fine. You just need to understand what the lay of the land is.
Yeah, that makes loads of sense. In terms of your, I guess, like activity mix, so events, what else? Like, what does the landscape look like in terms of marketing activity?
Yeah, so we have a broad tactic mix across earned and paid. So everything from white papers and blogs,
Uh-huh.
what we're doing on our website and sales enablement materials. The lesson I think we've really learned, especially over the last few years, is how they come together and feel like one,
Yep.
especially for our businesses, rather than different creative and different messaging for different parts of the same business. We've made a concerted effort to bring those tactics together. They now have a shared creative. They now have messaging which really ladders. It comes back to your point earlier. I think that takes a level of organization, and it takes a level of rigor to make sure that every time you're doing something new, you're adding something, you're innovating, it feels like it is part of something and not
Yeah.
just an add-on.
Yeah, definitely. And that point around sales is interesting because often, so I think if you look at content and marketing activity in the B2B world, but you start with sales, you go, what content does the sales team need or could do with to help convince someone that this is a good option, or to help nurture a lead, or to help, move that deal through the pipeline? And if you're thinking of content in that way first,
Yeah.
it completely changes like
Yeah.
your like your view on what content is needed, and you're no longer just creating stuff because it looks nice or anything like that. So I think that's a really good way of doing it. But then so many organizations, marketing and sales, are like at odds.
Yeah. I,
It's like this gulf in between.
I agree. I agree. And that works because the sales team is normally closest to the customer in a B2B organization. So they understand what the needs are, and if you can reflect those in your marketing, you start one step ahead of most.